October 2012, and off the coast of North Carolina, an unusual disaster has played out. Rescue helicopters have captured a terrifying but extremely rare sight: the remains of a battered and broken 18th century style sailing ship rolling heavily in the big seas. The devastated masts and spars rise out of the water, and there is no sign of the crew. At her stern is the name Bounty. This was no ordinary ship. In her time, she was a movie star, a beloved museum vessel built in 1960. But the story really began 220 odd years earlier, in April 1789, where, off the coast of a tiny isolated island, another ship was burnt to the waterline. She had been involved in one of the most infamous mutinies of all time, when the commander and his loyal followers were cast adrift in a lifeboat. Of course, her name was HMS Bounty. Here, separated by over 2 centuries, were 2 ships with the same name, one based on the other, and both met with disaster and connected by a deadly chain of events. 2 ships' captains separated by over 220 years, who would make decisions that would result in disaster from the decks of nearly identical sailing vessels. In this 2-part collaboration with the channel Brick Immortar, we'll explore the history and construction of these unique vessels, their reasons for being, and we'll learn all about what happened to the original Bounty back in 1789 and the dramatic series of events that inspired Hollywood to create a replica in 1960. Then, we'll learn all about the tragic fate of the replica as Sam from Brick Immortar analyses the final voyage in horrifying forensic detail. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is the incredible, tragic, true story of the 2 doomed bounties. (1788), and somewhere in the Indian Ocean sails the small, majestic HMS Bounty. She's a vessel of the Royal Navy, but she's not really a warship. Originally built as a merchant ship designed to carry coal, Bounty has been repurposed for a special mission. She had set out from England, departing Spithead the year earlier, and although she flies the Royal Navy's ensign, she's not an impressive vessel, armed only with a handful of 4-pounder cannons and some tiny swivel guns on her railings. She is not designed to engage enemy ships in combat. In fact, she barely even made an Admiralty rating at all. They designated her as a cutter, the smallest type of warship available. This seemingly benign fact would have dramatic ramifications for the entire crew within the coming months, especially for her commander. On the quarterdeck is William Bligh, a lieutenant of some experience. He had started life at sea when he was just 7 years old and had gone on to serve under the legendary navigator, Captain James Cook. In fact, Cook had handpicked him as sailing master for his 3rd and final voyage to the Pacific. Cook was killed, but then Bligh had managed to navigate the expedition back safely to England and a hero's welcome. He was a rising star in the Navy, and he had been the natural choice of command for this unusual mission. The goal was to bring back a unique plant, the breadfruit tree, from Tahiti. It's not a mission of war, but it had ugly undertones. Britain had a need to feed its vast number of slaves with cheap food that could provide high amounts of energy for the backbreaking labour they would be expected to perform. HMS Bounty must reach Tahiti and transport hundreds of specimens of the tree to the centre of the European slave trade in the Caribbean, where the plant would be expected to grow well. The mission itself would have ramifications for the ship's crew too, because Bounty was tiny. She was expected now to carry over 1,000 potted plants in addition to her nearly 50 men. Bounty is only about 200 tons, only 90 feet or 27.7 metres in length. Bligh's own great cabin had been converted to carry hundreds of potted trees, but for the weeks and months it takes to even reach Tahiti, the crew would have at least some space to breathe before taking on their cargo. Bligh was not a post captain. The Royal Navy stipulated at the time that a ship as small as a cutter could be commanded by a lieutenant, and as such he was the only actual officer on board. His right-hand man was Master John Fryer, but he hadn't been Bligh's original choice. Instead, he had asked for Fletcher Christian, a young man in his 20s who had become a senior petty officer. Bligh and Christian had served together before, and when Bligh had received his orders, he had sought Christian out specifically. Part of the deal was that even though he wasn't really an officer, he would be afforded all the luxuries and amenities an officer could expect. The Navy had turned his request down because Christian was too inexperienced. Instead, Bligh was given Friar, with Christian to serve as Friar's mate. Into the tiny ship were piled 46 men, mostly professional sailors of the Royal Navy. Most of them would be needed to simply operate the Bounty safely. Their ship was a 3-masted vessel with spars and booms that could mount an impressive display of canvas sails. The experience required to actually deploy the sails, especially in poor weather, was not to be underestimated. But for the initial stages of the voyage, conditions were already terribly cramped because adding to the list of crew were a pair of botanists who were tasked with ensuring the breadfruit trees actually survived the voyage. Bligh safely navigated his ship from England right down to South America and then under the Cape of Good Hope for the Indian Ocean. It was not easy going. Beset with wild weather, as was to be expected, the crew became increasingly more frustrated with Bligh's quirky command style. He had served with Captain James Cook, who was famous for his strict hygiene and health standards. Bligh imposed these on his men too, with what was later described as a fanatic zeal. His most serious misstep was the introduction of mandatory periods of dancing to music. This usually played a great role in maintaining crew morale, but because of the length of the sessions and the fact that they were mandatory, the crew began to resent their commander for it. But even worse, Bligh had begun to show favour for Fletcher Christian over John Fryer, and the latter began to grow jealous. As the months wore on and Bounty neared her intended destination, the dissatisfaction began to fester. Bligh was not a tyrant, but those 46 men were stuck with each other on a tiny ship for months at a time, and slowly the anthill of unhappiness began to grow into a mountain. Bligh made a series of small missteps that resulted in simmering resentment. He lent Christian some money, but the gesture proved awkward, and the younger man began to resent him for it. A seaman died as a result of bloodletting by the ship's doctor, who Bligh had then figured to be a useless drunk. And then Bligh and his mate, Fryer, had a very awkward disagreement which was resolved in front of the entire ship's crew, with Bligh reading the Articles of War. It was clear to the men that not all was well with those in command, but then, at Tahiti, everything changed. Almost overnight, the unhappiness disappeared because Bounty's men were introduced to a paradise world few could have imagined. The tropical sun beat down on stunning exotic plants and azure blue waters. The native Polynesian people greeted the ship and her crew happily and offered goods to trade. Bligh coordinated with the local chiefs and kings and made clear his intentions, and Christian led a party ashore to grow and nurture a crop of breadfruit plants to take back with them. The weeks wore on, and slowly things began to slip out of Bligh's control. The Bounty's men had lived their whole lives in near poverty in grey pre-industrial revolution Britain, but here was a vibrant, spectacular new life devoid of misery and backbreaking labour. While the plants were grown, Bounty's crew had little to do. Slowly, they began to settle into a peaceful existence and even married local women. The men and Bligh's petty officers began to grow slack. The commander became increasingly more frustrated with this. Flogging had been rare at sea under Bligh's command, but it became more regular as he tried to shake his men out of their complacency. But worst of all, Bligh and Christian's relationship had completely soured when Christian had married a local Polynesian girl and began to shirk his duties. Then, in January 1789, a trio of Bounty's men tried to desert the ship. Clearly, Bligh was about to lose all control of his men, and here one of the peculiarities of Bounty's mission reared its ugly head. The ship was tiny and only a cutter. It had not been given a detachment of Marines who would normally accompany a Royal Navy ship. Marines would of course protect the vessel from enemy borders, but they could also assist the captain maintaining control of his own crew. Bounty couldn't hope to fit a detachment of Marines, so it was all down to Bligh to coordinate with his petty officers and maintain control, but they were barely on speaking terms. Bligh ordered that the work be done quicker, and finally, in February 1789, Bounty was loaded with over 1,000 breadfruit trees, and the men were got aboard ready for departure. It was not a happy one. Back at sea, after months of happy, relaxed tropical life, the men were nearly despondent. Not only that, but conditions were now even worse than before. Many of these sailors had come from larger ships. They were used to cramped conditions, but larger ships meant more space to hang your hammock. Because Bounty was so small and her load of breadfruit trees was so large, it meant conditions were now miserable, more miserable than usual. Bligh's only option was to put his men on watch and watch, so one entire half of the ship remained on duty so the other half could rest. In April, the misery reached fever pitch when Bligh made his most serious error. He accused Fletcher Christian of theft and punished the entire ship's crew for it, stopping their rum ration and reducing their food. Early in the morning of April 28, 1789, as Bounty was sailing off the Tongan Islands, Bligh was woken in his sleep to find a loaded pistol pointed at him. He was tied up and marched up to the top deck. Brandishing a bayonet pointed straight at him was Fletcher Christian. Christian and a good portion of the crew couldn't stand the indignities any longer. They had seized control of the ship as Bligh slept after preparing for days, secretly finding out who might be with them in the event of a mutiny. Christian wasn't a murderer though. He and the mutineers had no interest in executing Bligh. The decision was made to put him away into a boat with limited provisions along with any other crew members who decided to remain loyal. But the mutineers were surprised to discover that nearly half the ship's complement decided to remain with their commander, including John Fryer, the ship's master. Around 20 men were loaded into the ship's largest boat and set adrift in the wide blue ocean. As Bounty sailed away, Bligh shouted after her, "I'll do you justice if ever I reach England," and these words would prove prophetic. Their situation seemed impossible, crammed into an open-top wooden boat with no friendly harbours for thousands of miles. Christian must have known their chances of survival were nearly non-existent, but he may have underestimated Bligh's abilities. If Bligh had proved a poor leader of men, then he was an exceptional navigator. He took the open-top boat to nearby islands before they were driven away by unfriendly encounters with native tribes, but the short stops allowed the men in the boat to refill their water and their provisions before undertaking the most intimidating voyage yet. Eating just an ounce of bread a day and a quarter of a pint of water mixed with rum, the men sailed their small boat over 3,500 miles, that's 6,500 kilometres, to Timor, where, with the Union Jack flying from the mast, the boat sailed into a Dutch settlement some 47 days after having been cast adrift. Bligh had promised justice, and they were not empty words. He sped back to England to report the mutiny in person, and before any of the mutineers could give their own accounts. He received a hero's welcome, and he was acquitted for the loss of his ship. But mutiny was a charge that could not go unanswered. The act had undermined the entire Navy's authority. Christian and the others would need to be rounded up. HMS Pandora, a frigate, was given the task of hunting the men down and bringing them back to trial. A number of bounty men were rounded up in the coming months, before Pandora herself was dramatically lost when she was grounded and sunk. The survivors were returned to England and underwent trial, but notably missing from their ranks was Fletcher Christian, the mastermind of it all. He had taken Bounty back to Tahiti, essentially kidnapped some of the islanders there under the pretense of having a party on board, and then sailed away to plot his next move. The mutineers took Bounty to far-flung and remote Pitcairn Island, the location of which was so little known that it took Christian and the men months of searching to even find it. Bounty was stripped of all her useful fixtures and a settlement was set up on the island where the men could live with their Polynesian wives. In January 1790, the ship was set ablaze and burnt to the waterline. Fletcher Christian would never be found, nor would he answer for his crime of mutiny, and it is thought that he was later killed, along with a number of others, by Tahitians, but not before he fathered a son named Thursday October, so named because Christian had said he wanted a name which would not remind him of England. The Bounty saga was a shock to the English Navy and the public alike, and it inspired plays and songs almost from the day the news had hit the headlines. Bligh, despite his mismanagement of the affair, didn't lose much standing with the Navy, and he went on to become a vice admiral and a governor. In fact, shortly after Bounty's loss, he took another ship to complete his initial mission and returned with the breadfruit trees, but this time he and the Admiralty had learned their lessons and they had taken 2 larger ships to do it. Debate still rages on Bligh and his reputation, but as the years wore on and legend took hold, he began to symbolise all that was wrong with ultimate authoritarian leadership. He became a symbol of harsh discipline and the ills of command. Bligh was depicted in plays, books, paintings, and pantomimes, but then, nearly 130 years after the mutiny had happened, he was first depicted on the big screen. Feature-length moving pictures captivated the world in the early 1910s. In 1916, a production sought to bring the story of the Bounty to life. The Mutiny of the Bounty was the first motion picture to tell the tale, and it certainly would not be the last, but today, as fate would have it, the film print is lost, and very little is known about it. In 1935, MGM produced Mutiny on the Bounty with Clark Gable, but then, 25 years later, the company sought to remake it in a bigger and better way. In 1960, production began on a film epic that was meant to be the most dramatic, accurate retelling of the saga yet attempted. To do it, the company needed a ship, but not just any ship would do. Bounty needed to be brought back to life. So it was that in 1960, an unusual commission was received by the Smith and Ruland shipyard of Nova Scotia. Using Admiralty blueprints and plans, they were to attempt something that had never yet been done: rebuild a large ship purely for a movie. It couldn't just be a set piece either. Just like the original, the replica would need to be able to sail to Tahiti for filming. 200 men worked over nearly a year to exact specifications, and the result was spectacular. A nearly perfectly accurate recreation of the original HMS Bounty. Crucially, the ship had to be sized up to double the original size so the film crew could actually fit on board. That wasn't the only concession either. The replica was every bit a modern vessel below the waterline, with bilge tanks and pumps and diesel engines turning to propellers. The replica Bounty set off for the very first time and reached Tahiti in late 1960. Starring in the film as Fletcher Christian was Hollywood legend Marlon Brando. And ironically, Brando, like Christian, fell in love with the location and said that every day, as soon as the director said cut for the last time, I ripped off my British naval officer's uniform and dove off the ship into the bay to swim with the Tahitian extras. Often we only did 2 or 3 shots a day, which left me hours to enjoy their company, and I grew to love them for their love of life. But the replica Bounty was not intended to live a long and happy life. Even though she was seaworthy, she was just designed to star in the film, and the final scene called for the ship to be burned. But Brando, who had just spent so much time on board and who had grown to love it, used his sway to prevent the destruction, and the replica Bounty survived. The movie had been made with love, an impressive eye for detail, but it still flopped at the box office. And sitting there as a lone, awkward reminder was the replica. Brando had prevented its destruction for the film, but fate would soon show he had merely postponed the inevitable. The Bounty replica went on to have a long Hollywood career, until finally, in 1993, the ship was donated to a foundation where she could offer educational cruises. The connection with Hollywood didn't end there though. One of her more notable roles after the original film for which she had been built was as a vessel in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. Into the 2000s, the ship underwent a number of restorations and overhauls. By 2010, Bounty was a regular sight at tall ship events and ports around the world, and then, just 2 years later, she was destroyed. In late 2012, meteorologists were alarmed to find that a long, low-pressure front in the Caribbean Sea was likely to develop into something much worse. Their worst fears were realised when it formed first a tropical storm and then a terrifying, unstoppable hurricane. Winds of up to 115 miles an hour, 185 kilometers per hour, ripped roofs off of houses in Jamaica and Cuba and deluged Haiti, Puerto Rico and others with monstrous rainfall. In late October, the hurricane swung around and began to head west-northwest for the US mainland. The storm was named Hurricane Sandy, and sitting at anchor directly in its path was the sailing ship Bounty. Aboard the ship was Captain Robin Walbridge with 15 of his crew. Walbridge had been Bounty's skipper for years. He'd formed a devoted and passionate group of volunteers, and they trusted his judgment implicitly. Most of them, though, were incredibly inexperienced, and 10 had been with the ship for only 6 months or less. Walbridge gathered his crew and told them the situation, that a storm was coming and likely to hit within the next few days, but he surprised them with his plan. He wanted to sail Bounty out. The ship was in New London, Connecticut, and Walbridge had intended to sail the ship down to St. Petersburg, Florida. He still intended to complete the voyage, but had decided to swing out further east to avoid the worst of the storm. He told his volunteer crew that a ship is always safer at sea than in port, and he planned to sail around the hurricane, but made it clear that the position was voluntary and they were not forced to join him. But nobody declined. Their ship had been thoroughly modernised with all the standard safety equipment you could expect on a vessel like this, including EPIRB positioning beacons, rafts, immersion suits and radio equipment. On October 26th, the Bounty set off. At sea, the ship rocked and rolled as she navigated the peaks and troughs of the monstrous seas. Captain Walbridge was maintaining a steady stream of communications with those back on land. Already he was dealing with criticism from concerned family and friends, but he dismissed it. The replica's Facebook page began to post regularly to assuage any fears and provide updates. A post on the 26th announced the departure and drew surprise, with one commenter saying, "Please be careful, Hurricane Sandy may morph into a Frankenstorm." The next day, Bounty was making nearly 7 knots in tall seas far off the Virginian coast. Walbridge had tried to steer his ship further east and clear the worst of the storm, but still, contact couldn't be avoided. They expected to face the storm front within the next day or so. The ship's Facebook page made a post reminding followers that the vessel was in capable hands and ended by saying, "Bounty's current voyage is a calculated decision, not at all irresponsible or with a lack of foresight as some have suggested. The fact of the matter is, a ship is safer at sea than in port." The next day, the storm had drifted closer and Walbridge may have then begun to understand the severity of the front. He messaged back saying, "I think we're going to be into this for several days. The weather looks like even after the eye goes by, it will linger for a couple of days. We're just going to keep trying to go fast and squeeze by the storm and land as fast as we can." The Bounty was rocked by nearly 30-foot waves and hit with nearly 90-knot gusts. The crew found it difficult even to remain upright, with some suffering some nasty falls, and then, at 6 p.m, with a failing engine and the worst of the storm at large, Captain Walbridge sent a distress call. On October 29, 2012, Coast Guard helicopters were greeted with a terrible sight: the battered remnants of a once proud ship. Bounty's masts were snapped like twigs, her spars twisted and her sails torn. Her crew had abandoned ship some 15 hours earlier, and all but 2 had been recovered after an epic rescue mission through the night. The 2 missing crew included volunteer crew member Claudine Christian and Bounty's captain, Walbridge, and the helicopters frantically searched the waves looking for any sign of them. Remarkably, Claudine was a direct ancestor of Fletcher Christian, who had led the mutiny on Bounty back in 1789. In this way, 2 ships with the same name, separated by 220-odd years, had both suffered terrible fates. In October 2012, the world awoke to the terrible news, and immediately, uncomfortable questions had to be asked. In fact, many still ask those questions to this day. But to understand what had actually happened aboard the Bounty replica, we need to peel back the layers of the story, because, from the outset, all was not as it seemed. We need to re-examine Bounty's story from the 1990s to her final brush with fate in 2012, her captain and the decisions he had taken that resulted in the ship's loss. There would be some shocking revelations. To analyse this series of mishaps and find out just what happened to the Bounty, it's hard to think of anybody better than Sam from Brick Immortar.
By the time Captain Walbridge finally conceded and agreed to notify the Coast Guard of the Bounty's distress, now only about 150 miles from the eye of Hurricane Sandy, quote, there had already been 3 crew injured, including himself, loss of the port main engine and port generator, problems with the starboard generator, blown out sails and damaged rigging, and flooding that had several feet of water in the bilges. But how would such a historic replica vessel be put into such a predicament, rather than sitting safely at port and educating the public? Why would a vessel with such a short-handed crew, rotting hull planks and untested bilges, radios, and sat phones get underway towards a hurricane? And most importantly, why would a captain of such a vessel intentionally, quote, chase hurricanes? We delve into this, the safety lessons learned, and much more in the second episode of this collab, Reckless Decision, The Loss of Tall Ship Bounty, over on Brick Immortar. Mike will have links below to check it out once you've finished watching this installment here on Ocean Liner Designs. Thanks again to Mike for having me on. Working together on this 2-part series has been incredibly fulfilling. Looking forward to more. This has been Sam with Brick Immortar. Don't forget, your safety matters.